Scientists took a mammal brain that had been dead for 4 hours and turned the cells back on. Not in a sci-fi movie, in a real lab, with a real experiment and real peer-reviewed results. And that's not even the most unsettling thing they found. Here's what's actually happening when a person dies, based on the research most people have never heard of. Not philosophy, not religion, just biology. And it is genuinely strange enough that it's been quietly rewriting what doctors thought they knew. So let's walk through it. We're going to cover what happens to your brain in the final minutes, what happens to your cells in the hours after, what happens to people with dementia right before the end, and then we'll get to the one finding that researchers are still struggling to explain because it's the most disorienting of all of them. I'll get there, but the setup matters. The first thing to understand is that the brain doesn't just shut off like a light switch. There's a final surge. In a landmark 2013 study, researchers recorded rats' brains during cardiac arrest and found a burst of gamma wave activity, the fastest, most consciousness-associated brainwave frequency, that spiked within 30 seconds of the heart stopping, and it actually exceeded gamma levels seen during normal waking life. That's not a flat line. That's a spike. Then a 2023 study on 4 dying human patients found that 2 of them showed the exact same gamma surge, along with increased connectivity between brain regions linked to conscious processing. Neurologist Jimo Borjigin, who led that research, has speculated this surge could be the biological explanation for life flashing before your eyes. The thing near-death survivors have described for decades, though she's also careful to say it might just be a side effect of oxygen deprivation, not real conscious experience at all. The honest answer is that nobody knows yet, but the surge is real, it's been measured, and it's way bigger than anyone expected. Now here's where it gets even more complicated, because the brain's activity doesn't just spike and then go dark. It keeps going longer than medicine assumed. Cognitive activity and awareness during cardiac arrest are reported, but poorly understood. And a first-of-its-kind study set out to examine consciousness and its underlying electrical markers during CPR. That study was NYU's AWARE-2, led by Dr. Sam Parnia, and it monitored 567 in-hospital cardiac arrest patients with real-time EEG. The research found that the brain can show signs of electrical recovery long into ongoing CPR. We're talking 35 to 60 minutes after the heart stopped. That's far past the point where doctors traditionally assume the brain had gone dark. About 20% of survivors reported features consistent with what researchers have started calling a recalled experience of death, not a near-death experience, which is the pop culture term, but a more clinically precise label that signals the field is taking this seriously enough to rename it. Some EEG activity deemed compatible with consciousness was detected during resuscitation, at least in some frequencies and brain areas. This directly challenges the old assumption that brain cells begin irreversible damage within about 10 minutes of losing oxygen. So we've got a brain that surges at the moment of death and keeps showing signs of activity long after the heart stops. But here's the part that really messes with the biology, because it turns out death at the cellular level isn't even a single moment. In 2019, Yale scientists took pig brains that had been dead for 4 hours, and pumped a custom solution through them. Neurons fired spontaneous electrical bursts. Cells resumed metabolizing oxygen and glucose. Blood vessels responded to drugs. The researchers were clear that there was no organized brain-wide activity resembling consciousness. But the core assumption that brain cells become irreversibly destroyed within minutes of losing blood flow? Gone. Then a 22 follow-up applied a similar system to a pig's entire body 6 hours after death and observed spontaneous muscle movements in the head and neck during the process, despite the animals being clinically dead the entire time. What this tells us is that death at the cellular level is more of a gradual process with a reversible window than a single moment, which is part of why the scientific and legal definitions of death don't actually line up with each other as neatly as we'd like to think. And if all of that is already more than you expected to learn today, keep watching, because the last thing we're going to cover is the one that caregivers have been quietly witnessing for over 200 years. And that medicine didn't even bother to give a name until 2009. Before we get there, if this kind of thing is interesting to you, Hitting subscribe means you'll see the next video when it drops. And I'm genuinely curious. Did you already know about any of this? Drop it in the comments because the replies on topics like this are always worth reading. Now, hearing. There's a 2020 University of British Columbia study that fitted EEG electrodes on hospice patients and played tone patterns to them while they were conscious, and then again once they had become unresponsive near death. Some patients' brains kept reacting to changes in sound in a pattern statistically similar to healthy young adults. The brain signal they found, called a mismatch negativity response, reflects basic auditory processing. Researchers were careful to say that's not the same as understanding words or meaning, but it does give a real neurological basis for something palliative care nurses have said for decades, that dying people can still register voices in the room even after they can no longer respond, which is why hospice staff coach families to keep talking normally, to keep saying what they need to say, rather than assuming no one's listening. Hearing appears to genuinely be the last sense to fade, so the brain surges at death, stays active longer than expected, and the cells themselves resist dying for hours, and the person may still be hearing you even when they can't respond. Now here's the last one, and this is the one I told you about at the start, the one that's been documented for over 200 years without a name. Terminal lucidity is a phenomenon characterized by the sudden reappearance of cognitive clarity in patients with severe cognitive impairment, such as dementia, near death. It's sometimes called the rally, an unexpected return of mental clarity, memory, and the ability to communicate in a person whose mind had been severely impaired, occurring in the short period, often hours to days before death. In one analysis of 124 people with dementia who experienced these episodes, more than 80% showed a return of responsive verbal ability, memory, and orientation. Families describe prolonged eye contact after months of a vacant gaze, coherent speech, recognition of relatives by name, and the recollection of long-buried autobiographical memories. The term terminal lucidity was only coined in 2009, even though physicians had been quietly recording such cases for around 250 years. 2.5 centuries of documented cases, and medicine didn't formally name it until 16 years ago. Once dismissed as folklore or wishful thinking on the part of grieving families, terminal lucidity is now the subject of serious scientific attention, and researchers, hospice teams, and national health agencies have begun to document, define, and investigate it. Here's why it's so biologically strange. Dementia involves physical brain tissue damage, neurons that are actually gone. Traditionally, it was thought that once neural pathways are damaged in Alzheimer's disease, the decline is permanent. But terminal lucidity suggests that cognitive decline might be reversible, at least momentarily. This phenomenon is unlikely to result from the repair of damaged pathways. Instead, it seems more plausible that these lucidity episodes arise from the spontaneous formation of neural bypasses, temporary connections that restore connectivity at the network level, facilitating a transient resurgence of cognitive functions. Some researchers speculate it connects to the same kind of last-ditch homeostatic surge seen in the gamma wave research, the brain making one final, inexplicable effort. But that's still an open question, not a settled answer. The time may have come to move terminal lucidity from the footnotes of medical history into the foreground of scientific inquiry. Because whatever future research reveals, this phenomenon is already reshaping how we think about dementia, and more fundamentally, how we think about consciousness, dying, and what remains of the person even when it seems all has been lost. So here's where we actually are. The brain surges with its highest frequency activity at the moment the heart stops, bigger than anything seen during normal waking life. Consciousness-linked brain waves have been recorded up to an hour into CPR, long past when doctors assumed the lights were out. Cells in a mammal brain can be reactivated hours after death, which means dead at the cellular level is less of a hard line than medicine assumed. Hearing is likely the last sense to go, and the evidence suggests people register sound even when they can't respond. And then there's terminal lucidity, a real statistically documented phenomenon where people with advanced dementia come back, briefly and completely, right before the end, and we still don't fully understand why. What's changed from the start of this video is that death isn't a moment, it's a process. And the edges of that process are a lot blurrier and a lot more active than most of us were ever taught. If this made you think of someone, or if you knew about any of these findings already, tell me in the comments. And if you want to go deeper on how the brain handles extreme states, there's a video right here that connects directly to what we just covered, worth watching back to back.